Welcome to the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable's July monthly call, Navigating Monetary Policy in the Sea of Macro Risks. I'm Ali Togo, president of the Roundtable, and we're glad you're able to join us this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Roundtable sponsors. We're glad to have such a wonderful group of sponsors who are so actively involved from within the industry. And today we're happy to welcome Ultimus Leverpoint as our newest sponsor. This event is being, if someone could mute, that would be great. This event is being done as a webinar, so you won't be able to see the other participants, but you will still be able to ask questions of the panelists through the chat function or the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to do so. Today we are happy to welcome Edward Price and Nick Stadtmiller, who will delve into some of the many challenges that central banks around the world face right now as they try to manage issues ranging from soaring inflation to ongoing supply chain issues and fears of recession. Edward Price is a political economist and non-resident senior fellow and adjunct instructor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. Additionally, he consults on macro risk for clients and investment firms. As a former UK government trade official, he is frequently a speaker on Bloomberg Radio, BBC World Business, and at conferences, and his work is regularly published in the Financial Times, Alphaville, and Barron's. He was educated at the London School of Economics. Nick Stadtmiller is an emerging markets strategist at Medley Advisors, where he helps investors navigate the interplay between markets and policy. He has more than 15 years' experience in financial markets and economic policy, including stints in Dubai and in Istanbul, excuse me. And now I'd like to turn things over to Nick and Ed. Nick, please lead us in today's discussion.
Thanks, Ali. As Ali alluded to, and good afternoon, everyone, by the way. As Ali alluded to, we are really at a period of global macroeconomic uncertainty and difficult conditions that we haven't seen in decades, with inflation in the US and Europe around 9%, and in some emerging economies, it's well into double digits. At the same time, we're seeing increased fears of a recession, and we have rising geopolitical tensions with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, also creating supply shocks in commodities markets, including higher oil prices, and also fears that Russia would shut off gas exports to Europe, which would obviously deeply harm activity there. Rising food prices, in addition to contributing to inflation, are also contributing to food insecurity issues in many developing countries in particular. And as a result of all this macro uncertainty, we're seeing quite aggressive steps from several large central banks. The Federal Reserve recently raised interest rates by 75 basis points. They haven't made a move to the higher side of that magnitude since 1994. The ECB is releasing their interest rate decision tomorrow, and there is chatter that they might raise interest rates by 50 basis points, which would be the first time that they've made an interest rate hike of that time in the 20 years that the ECB has been in existence. So amid all of this uncertainty, high inflationary pressures forcing central bankers to tighten policy in very strong increments, and we're also seeing these risks to growth. Ed, I would like to ask you, what do you think central bankers are thinking about in this interplay between price stability and growth, and how do you think that affects their decision-making process at this time?
Nick, I want to say that they're thinking about what they're always thinking about, which is essentially avoiding the two great mistakes that central banks can make, right? So taking the punch bowl away too early, or alternatively leaving it there too long. But I don't think it's that simple now. And if we sit down and say to ourselves, well, okay, what is the calculus? What is the tool, the thought process that central bankers are using to navigate the environment that you just described very well? I think we're going to have to describe it as lacking. So if you take a step back, central bankers have been signaling, particularly the Fed, since about 2018, that what they traditionally refer to as the natural rates of A, B, and C are elusive. And I think that when we're looking at the situation today, we're going to have to say, well, actually, they're probably not there at all. And so let me give you one example of what I mean by that. Central bankers thinking, of course, about the policy rate. We've got the ECB tomorrow, as you said, and we can describe the policy rate as R star or whatever the best rate is for the economy. But this is where we run into trouble, because what do we mean by the economy? After this very long period of persistent low inflation and low interest rates, I think what we've really done is separated the real economy and from the financial economy and its monetary needs. So if you think about what the financial economy needs, it needs liquidity in it, and what we want from it as policymakers is stability. A low rate of interest and easy interest. But the real economy right now, of course, needs a higher rate of interest very quickly. And I think the Fed and other central banks are behind this one. It needs different R-star, so to speak. So just using that one example, and I'll wrap up by saying this, I think if central bankers are sitting down and thinking what they're always thinking, which is, well, what should the policy rate be? They're thinking, I would that there are at least two policy rates that there should be, which is, of course. So I mean, Nick, that's a bit of out there opinion. I'd be interested if you think I've floated off into space, or if you'd agree.
Well, I think your insight, which I remember you wrote about this at the beginning of this year, I believe, in an article in the FT, about this idea that there are really sort of two ideal interest rates. One is what financial markets need, and the other is what the real economy needs, given inflationary conditions. And I think that the interplay between the real economy and the financial economy is quite interesting here. Jan Hatzius at Goldman Sachs wrote a paper about 4 or 5 years ago where he talked about the fact that the transmission mechanism from the policy rate directly into the economy is not the same as what it used to be. But what you do have is you have a policy rate from the Fed and a policy stance. It's not just the policy rate, it's also the balance sheet, feeding into several macro variables. One of them obviously being long-term interest rates, equity prices, liquidity in the spreads in the credit markets, and how those financial variables affect the real economy. And so what you have is essentially the Fed is able to control monetary conditions, as we define kind of loosely, but largely those variables, in a very blunt way through the policy rate, and then those financial conditions filter into the economy. So I think that only adds to the uncertainty and the difficulty of the Fed's decision, because they're controlling the policy rate, but they don't know if overhiking is going to cause the equity market to plummet by 20%, or if it's going to cause long-term interest rates to rise by 150 basis points, or some other disastrous outcome. So I think even though the tendency is to be aggressive to deal with inflation, there's also that worry that if you turn the dial too much, that you might over-tighten financial conditions. And there's not a page in a guidebook that says, if you hike the Fed funds rate by this amount, this is the result on the real economy. They're dealing with a lot of uncertainty in that transmission.
Right.
And on the subject of transmission, actually, I'd like to turn things over to the ECB, which I know you also follow. They're in a very difficult spot right now, because in addition to dealing with 9% inflation, or nearly 9% inflation, they're also dealing with financial fragmentation. There's obviously been a lot of political volatility in Italy recently, with the Draghi government nearly falling, and the spreads on Italian bonds have widened a lot over bonds, German bonds. So this creates the challenge for the ECB that they need to tighten to get inflation down, but they don't want to overly tighten financial conditions that could potentially destabilize sovereign bond markets, particularly in Italy. So how do you think the politics of this plays out? I mean, to one extent, I would think that the central bank wants to put the feet of Italian policymakers to the fire to get them to enact credible reforms to get their debt burden down. But at the same time, they can't risk going too far and potentially destabilizing the whole Eurozone system just to get consumer price growth down.
Yeah, right. So the IMF just came out and said that if Russia cuts the gas off, we're looking at a contraction of above 5% in Italy, some other countries, including Czechoslovakia. So a contraction of 5% in Italy, I think, qualifies as bad, given the dynamics that you just described. And so, again, I really don't know how the ECB gets through this, because that tension spread between 10-year borrowing costs, Italy, Germany, the wider that gets, and I think it might have rallied on the news of Draghi saying hinting he would stay, but the trend is clear. The wider that spread gets, essentially you're looking at an indicator as to whether or not the Eurozone itself can survive. And this might lead into a discussion of what Putin's overall strategy is, right, which I don't think is solely military. But the question at hand is, well, what does the ECB do? Slight pause, slight shrug. Again, we're back in this dilemma, which is if you want to get your arms around inflation, my 2 cents is that you are going to induce a recession. There's no two ways about it at this stage in the monetary cycle. If you are inducing a recession, of course, that bleeds into the political economy of the euro itself, and it bleeds into the political economy of the confrontation with Russia. And it might even bleed into the ability or otherwise of NATO to continue to confront Russia. So, I mean, I'm going to turn the question around back on you. Again, number one, am I being too gloomy? And number two, and this is with reference to emerging markets too, do you think I'm right when I say that inducing recession is essentially the only card left to play?
Well, the answer to the second question, very briefly, I think is a simple yes. And I think the interesting theme you get is central banks focusing their rhetoric on price stability, but then they've got all these sort of secondary concerns that they have that they don't really want to talk about. So in the case of the ECB, for example, you have the policy rate and short-term interbank costs, which is what they focus on, which they'll talk about. That's obviously the product of their rate decisions. They say what changes they make in their target rates. But at the same time, sort of in the background, they talk about anti-fragmentation and making sure that monetary policy is transmitted properly. But implicitly, there's a second target, which is the interest rate or the spread on Italian bonds over German bonds. So they don't want to say that explicitly. Obviously, they're never going to say, oh, we're targeting 200 basis points over German bonds for Italian BTPs. But latently, it's there. And then the other part, which you brought up, is the risk of a recession. And so far, the Fed particularly has been adamant that they think they can engineer a soft landing. I'm a bit more skeptical of that. In emerging markets, I think the case is even more compelling, that a lot of these central banks are going to have to engineer recessions in order to get inflation down for a variety of reasons. One is nobody really knows what the lingering supply shock of COVID was in terms of how much of a change to potential output that we had. And potential output is notoriously difficult to measure in real time, but most inflation models talk about the output gap, which is the difference between how much the economy is actually producing and how much the economy can at its theoretical potential. And if there are lingering downside shocks to potential output as a result of the pandemic that are still around, then probably that means that GDP activity has to be brought down a lot more than most people realize to get inflation down. So that's one uncertainty for emerging markets. The other uncertainty they have is what the Fed is doing and how aggressive the Fed's going to be in raising interest rates. And even though the Fed probably doesn't really care that much about economic conditions in emerging markets, absent some sort of systemic global shock for an EM crisis, emerging market central banks really care what the Fed does, because emerging market economies import financial conditions from the dollar, because so much trade in international finance, a lot of loans in the emerging world are in dollars. So higher dollar interest rates means a stronger dollar, weaker emerging market currencies, and higher borrowing costs in dollar terms for emerging market countries and a lot of large companies. So emerging markets are raising local interest rates to cool off local demand, and at the same time, they're getting more monetary tightening from the Fed raising interest rates. And so it's giving a double shock to their economy. Now, you would think, well, maybe what you should do as an EM central bank is, okay, say we're going to take our foot off the pedal. We're not going to hike as aggressively because the Fed is doing some of the lifting for us. But that doesn't actually work. And the reason is because as the Fed hikes, if an EM central bank stops hiking, the interest rate spread between that emerging market currency and on the US dollar actually shrinks, which tends to weaken that currency. So if EM central banks say, okay, we're going to let the Fed do the heavy lifting of the tightening, they'll actually induce more weakening of their own currency, which actually further feeds inflation because a weaker currency means imported goods in local currency terms cost more. So it almost forces EM central banks to continue hiking, even if they think they're going right into a recession. And you've already heard a couple of peeps from a couple of central banks about this. The central bank in Chile, for example, their base case is for a recession, actually for negative growth for 2023 as a whole. And they've still committed to hiking, and the market still has about 75 or 80 basis points of additional hikes penciled in from Chile this year. Another central bank, Poland, has taken a slightly more sanguine approach, which is that the governor of the NBP, Adam Glapiński, has said that they may be done hiking, that they see a peak in inflation coming soon, and as long as inflation does peak, that they may not hike again, even though the policy rate in Poland is nearly 10 percentage points below where headline inflation is. And Glapiński has talked about that risk of a recession being another reason why the central bank maybe should stop hiking rates. Ultimately, I think further currency weakness is going to drag a lot of these central banks that are hesitant to hike more in the face of a recession to continue hiking right up until that point. So, the short answer to your question, Ed, is yes, these central banks probably need recessions to cool inflation down. But in the emerging world, because of some of these unintended consequences of importing dollar financial conditions, it becomes that much more complex and probably means even more severe recessions, and essentially that they're forced to hike right up until that point.
Right.
Maybe to move on a little bit, you touched briefly on the geopolitical impacts of Putin's war in Ukraine and how that may impact conditions in Europe. I'd like to get your views about what essentially have we seen in terms of an impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on Europe up to this point, and how has that fed into financial markets and how that's weighing on confidence and growth in Europe going forward.
Right. Well, I think the first impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on Europe and indeed on the world is that we've all realized that the First World War and the World War are finished. It's this sort of deep structural dread, which is, it's almost as if the writers of, Earth Season X have got lazy because they're going back to the old scripts from seasons, 2 and 3 with tank battles and artillery battles in Europe. So I think the first thing, it's very esoteric, but people are really in some sort of ontological shock. And they're thinking, and this goes for markets as well, they're thinking to themselves, well, if this is now the frontier of possibility, if we're talking about pitched battles in Europe again, between Russia, which is of course Europe, and by proxy Germany, which is weird, right? And the United States. Then what else are we thinking about, and what else can we imagine? So that's the esoteric. Like the exoteric is doubling down on the supply chain situation. And if you take, you read about this every day in press, grain, right? Bread, one of the most important things in the world, right? It's not electric vehicles, it's not SpaceX, it's bread. Bread's being dropped, and then you really start to have think about what do labor markets and what do political economies look like in African countries, in the Middle East, and again Europe. So for me, I think it's really a question of what is it that would constitute a victory for both sides. When you think about what it is constitutes a victory for either side, you can't get there. I can't get there anyway. I can't get to a point where I think, oh yes, Zelensky's forces push Russia out of Ukraine. And I can't really imagine that is going to take the whole of Ukraine at any given period. And so you probably want to say to yourself, well, maybe there's a new structural norm in the global economy, which is buy of certain commodities is disrupted, and the military situation is in flux. So at that point, I think again it goes back to central bankers and these notions like around in our heads, and it seems to me that a lot of economists and central banks at the moment are thinking about these micro risks in terms of how do we get past them, how do we get back to normal, how do we get past this difficult period, which I think COVID was treated as a cycle, and the war in Ukraine is being treated as a cycle. I think they're probably structural. So Nick, I mean, you know more about that neck of the woods than I do. Do you think that one definition of a Russian victory, if you like, is that they just continue to do what they're doing and they just continue to disrupt the world economy and, by proxy, the euro?
I think one interesting divergence between the perspective in the Kremlin and in most Western capitals is that both sides, for a number of years now, have seen decay of the other side as almost inevitable. Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin have had this idea that Western liberal democracy and the transatlantic alliance and the unity is under pressure. And of course, a lot of skeptical statements from former President Donald Trump in the United States about the unity of NATO really sort of fed that narrative in the Kremlin, and also the rise of a number of populist leaders, including Mr. Trump, and also a number of populist parties in Europe who haven't quite taken power, but have been much more successful at the ballot box in recent elections. So Putin and a lot of the Kremlin have this existing narrative that decay of Western liberal democracy is inevitable, and they only need to wait it out. So I think that this goes to your strategy. You were saying that I think the Kremlin will seek, whatever happens specifically in Ukraine, the Kremlin will seek to destabilize Western institutions and Western governments for the foreseeable future, as long as that regime is in power, I would think, unless there's a major turning point within Russian politics. And the same side on the West, I think a lot of people have seen Russia as sort of this paper tiger that, yes, they have nuclear weapons, and what was actually before the war with Ukraine thought to be a much more powerful military than it turned out that they have, but that there were all these underlying economic insecurities and vulnerabilities, and that they were overly reliant on oil and gas exports. And that underneath all of this, there was just an economy in Russia that couldn't grow. So the solution is just sort of to wait it out and let Russia implode within itself economically. So I think, given that backdrop, that both sides have this idea that the decay of the other side is sort of inevitable, I think we should really brace ourselves here for a long-term confrontation. And I think, from Russia's approach to the West, that's going to be as much political interference and confusion and disinformation that they can pump into Western discourse and into the political process to the extent that they can do that. But I think in the much more immediate sphere, I think one should very seriously consider the risk of further disruptions of energy supplies. And I'm thinking specifically about gas shipments here. And I don't know what the timing of this might be, but I think the risks that the Russians shut the gas off into Europe are quite high. One, because I think that this is a really good way to test transatlantic unity. The Russians were caught off guard by the speed and the unity with which the US, European allies, and other allies and partners around the world unified in support of Ukraine against Russia. But I think there's still this lingering suspicion that they can catch the West off guard and maybe sow some dissension. And I think creating economic pain by cutting off gas supplies is a great way to do that. Another thing I think that would incentivize them to cut off the gas is the fact that Europe has essentially carved gas out of the menu of options for sanctions. But at the same time, Europeans have committed to ending their dependence on Russian fossil fuels by 2027. And historically, the Russians always, despite political tensions, and even during the Soviet times, the Soviets and then the Russians always had an incentive to continue providing gas simply because they wanted to be perceived as a reliable partner. But now you're in a phase of the game where we're actually winding down, and it doesn't make sense to me that the Russians would say, gee, Germany, we're sorry to lose you as a customer, but don't worry, we're going to be a reliable supplier all the way down to zero consumption in 2027. Right. So, from that perspective, I think that the Russians, have some incentive there. I don't think that a cutoff of Russian supplies, even though it's widely being talked about and it's partially priced into markets, I don't think the surety of this happening is fully priced in, which means if we do get a cutoff, I think there could be a pretty severe shock, not only to the European economy, obviously, but also to financial markets. And I think that feeds back into this question about how central bankers react to this. And so I want to ask you a couple of things. One, do you think the ECB has to stop hiking if Russia cuts off the gas supplies into Europe? And two, does this change their calculus at all in terms of how they handle the transmission mechanism and peripheral bond spreads, like Italy? Does it, change the dealings between Brussels and the ECB and some of these other economies that have been sort of dragging their feet on reforms?
Right. To be fair to the Russians, they don't do things in a way that's predictable. So to your point about not being a reliable supplier, I'm pretty sure that the Russians are going to taunt Europe with the gas situation rather than it off. And if they do turn it off, they'll probably turn it back on. Right. So the Russians like to act on the offbeat, and they like to do things that will keep us guessing for some time. Let's say the Russians did turn the gas off. I can't really get my head around how that wouldn't be World War III, right? Because that becomes an existential threat to European citizens, elderly German citizens, and so on, right? That no longer have access to energy in the winter. And again, goes back to what I was saying about the undecided aspect of World War I and World War II, which was essentially the same thing, right? There's this like big flat space between Moscow and Berlin.
Recorded.
Hi, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think maybe the Russians are in this call now. Talking about disruption, right? So I think the real dynamics are that if we accept the premise that the Russians want to continue this, or that they've accepted that they have to continue this, and this is their new strategy, I don't think they want to bring it to a head, right? And we focus all the time on whether it would be wise to close the airspace and so on, because the Russians might overreact. I think we could also imagine that the Russians are thinking about how the Americans might overreact. So are they going to cut the gas off? Maybe, but I don't think it will be like, that's it and it's gone. I think they'll tease us for a while. Right? I mean, is that?
I think that's definitely a possibility, but I think another aspect of this is that the gas card for the Russians is a wasting asset. The longer they wait, if they do this in 23, the effect is slightly less than it would have been if they had done it this year. If they wait until 24 to cut the gas off, the effect is even lower. So the value of playing the gas card from a geopolitical standpoint favors doing it sooner. And I think also the timing within the year, doing this closer to the winter time, obviously has a larger impact, because not only are you talking about gas demand for industry, but also for heating. And as you pointed out, this is not just a threat to German factories. This is a threat to German citizens being able to heat their homes. So, the Europeans are trying really hard to come up with contingency plans. And there have been a lot of comments that the Europeans are planning, for the worst. Just today, it was announced that the European Commission is asking different European countries to voluntarily reduce gas demand by about 15%, sort of in preparation for that contingency. So I think that I'm certainly not predicting that this is going to happen tomorrow or next week, but I think overall the political calculus for Russia favors doing this sooner. But I think, the whole question about, gas supplies from Russia into Europe, grain supplies obviously have been under severe stress because of Russia's blockade on Ukraine, which is preventing Ukrainian grain getting into the world markets. And, it's not just Russia's war in Ukraine, but also if you go back over the last couple of years into the whole COVID backdrop, where you had severe shocks to global supply chains as a result of the pandemic, causing a lot of countries to rethink their supply chains. And, I think Russian gas was a bit controversial, but what was definitely consensus for most of the last 20 years was offshoring production into China and other parts of the world to make more widgets and make them cheaper is a good thing for the global economy. There was obviously a strong surge within German political circles thinking that getting cheap gas from Russia, was a good thing. And so you had this era of decades of let's buy whatever we can elsewhere in the world cheaper, and let's assume that all of these products are going to be supplied in a reliable fashion. And the last couple of years have, brought that into question. And I think, to throw that forward, you get into the trend of nearshoring or reshoring production and supply chains, bringing those supply chains back home, which probably means reorientating a lot of investment. It definitely means that, but it probably also means higher costs for consumers. And so, Ed, I'm curious to get your take on what the political economy is here. Policymakers thinking about the security of provisioning resources and products, but also thinking about the impact on consumers if those products are a bit more costly or if they're a bit delayed.
Well,
Ed,
You're muted.
Sorry, guys, I tried a different audio stream using a telephone, and that hasn't worked. So hopefully I'll just go back to the normal audio stream. You guys can hear me. All right, so I look at friend shoring, and I think to myself, to your point about globalization, that's not really economics, right? Or at least that's not mainstream economics. That's not the pursuit of market scale. That's not pursuit of efficiency. That's not the pursuit of marginal gains and so on. That's essentially autarky, or it's essentially a regional block. And if you wanted to be crude about it, and if you wanted to be crude about USMCA, the EU, and respectively, you could describe them as these continental economies that, as much as they are a subfunction of globalization, they are a challenge to the very premise of globalization, which is that they also have the latent potential for essentially a war footing, right? If you really think about the logic of framing, it means we're going to get our stuff from people we can trust that are closer to us, probably, right? And so then that, I don't know if that is then I don't know if then consumers and consumption is really the right domain to be about these things. I think it's probably more like, are you able to, well, essentially create a subsistence economy if you need to? And are you able to maintain the technology and other commodity-based and information-based systems that you need if, in the worst case scenario, globalization is totally disrupted? Okay, now I don't necessarily agree with that premise. I don't think that I think it's a form of intellectual vanity to imagine that we can wrap our arms around the complex system that is the global economy and say, well, you know, we had this fallacy in the 90s and early 2000s that liberal democracy was in the driving seat, and we've now realized that that was a mistake and everything is doomed. I think that swinging the other way is probably also justicious, and actually globalization, in the sense that are exposed to each other's economies and exposed to each other's risks, is only now coming into its own. It's only now going up as a closed system that you can see risk transfer, and you can see other sorts of truly globalized phenomena, for example, COVID, right? So you've got these two tracks the whole time. One is that people, as they become aware of globalization, you're seeing things like Trump, you're seeing things like Brexit, and you're probably seeing things like the potential annexation of Ukraine by Russia. But that's not a function of globalization breaking down necessarily. That's a function of globalization. So I would take friendshoring with a pinch of salt. But I'd be interested, Nick, in your thoughts, because one of the things I wanted to ask you is, are we going back to a world in which so-called emerging markets form another non-aligned bloc as per the Cold War, right? Is it possible for emerging markets to sit this one out?
Well, I think I agree with you that I don't think that the end of globalization means that, you know, there's not going to be any more trade. I don't think we're going to, you know, descend into this trend towards autarky like you got in the 1930s, say. But I think that the realization that there are supply chain risks to increase globalization probably puts a cap on the marginal increase of this. And I think, you know, from a capital flows perspective, it's quite interesting, because if you go back to traditional economic textbooks, they talk about developing countries being capital poor and in need of capital from wealthy countries. So effectively, the flow of foreign investment goes from wealthy countries into developing countries to help them build infrastructure and develop their economies. But what's actually happened over the last 20 years, in the most salient and important examples, and I'm thinking, you know, particularly here of, you know, the Persian Gulf and of China, is that these developing economies were exporting resources to the developed world. In the case of, you know, the Gulf, it was oil. In the case of China, it's all sorts of widgets, you know, that were manufactured more cheaply there. And then they took the trade surplus and they exported that capital. So, you know, the United States and a lot of developing countries, Germany and Japan being sort of outliers here, but a lot of these developed economies actually run trade deficits or current account deficits, which means that they are net importers of capital. And so the petrodollars in the Middle East and the Chinese foreign exchange reserves were essentially ways that these economies were, one, able to keep their currencies relatively weak, and two, were able to recycle the trade surpluses that they were making. And that had a big impact on global interest rates. And it's a big part of the reason why long-term interest rates in the developed world have been so low for the last couple of decades. So in my mind, you know, that's one major shift. They're slightly different because, you know, in the case of China, you're talking about supply chain production, whereas in the Middle East, you're talking about provision of natural resources. But I think any shift to those trends, to the amount of oil that we import in the developed world, the amount of manufacturing and production that we offshore into China and other emerging countries, that is going to come back in the form of higher capital costs for us, which has an implication obviously for growth and also for monetary policy and interest rates. So that's the economic aspect. But to get to the political question you were asking about whether emerging markets can position themselves as a non-aligned bloc, I think it will be difficult, but many will try, is the short answer. I think, particularly in the Gulf countries, you've seen a rather relaxed approach, I would say, to taking sides in the West versus Russia over Russia's invasion in Ukraine. The Saudis and the UAE have not openly flouted sanctions, but they have, in a way, tried to stay out of it. India also, because they, of course, have been importing oil at a large discount from the Russians relative to global benchmark prices. As a result of the sanctions, they're able to get cheaper oil. So they have a strong incentive not to weigh in too hard against the Russians. Also, in the case of Brazil, which is very dependent on fertilizer imports from Russia, they've also tried to take sort of a backseat approach. But I think that the United States' hegemony, in the global trade and financial system, will ultimately force these countries to pick a side. And the question really is not geostrategic; it's really purely economic. Do you want to be part of the Western rules-based order and the Western economy, which means selling, your products into Western markets? Do you want to be integrated into the Western financial system? And do you want all those benefits that accrue from membership in that club? And so I think, in the short run, a lot of these countries will try not to pick a side to the extent that they can. But in the long run, I think they will be forced to move more towards the West and ultimately shun Russia in the process. I would like to mention generally to all the guests, if you would like to have any questions, we can have a look at that. We're getting towards the end of the hour, about 15 minutes left. So I'll mention that. We do have a couple of questions that I'd like to bring up. They've been asked. One of them, Ed, I'll put this to you. The price of housing here in the United States has risen substantially since the start of COVID, fueled by low rates, supply chain bottlenecks, and building materials, as well as migration from urban areas. What are your views on the housing market as the Fed continues to tighten?
Well, Nick, I've predicted 175 of the last 5 crises. So my natural inclination is that it's going to load. I personally, I experienced the house price phenomenon during the pandemic, and what the sticker price on my home now is absolutely not what it's worth. It's head scratching. So I imagine that not cars, not just houses, cars, the sort of anything that's exposed to credit risk. Those segments, I think, as the Fed hikes, we're going to see people really losing out, and that's also because of the impact on staples, right? So if inflation is 9, 10, 11%, and I think it's probably trending upwards, then you really do get to a point where you have to eat, and probably there are large parts of the economy here, the labor market here, that will no longer be able to afford mortgage payments or indeed rent, right? So I mean, flip the same question back to you, but I think it's probably going to be one of the casualties.
Yeah, and a point I made earlier about financial conditions and the impact of the stock market and long-term interest rates and credit markets on the economy, I think applies here, which is, there's an income effect, which is that if consumers make more money, if your company gives you a 20% pay rise, you tend to spend more money. But there's also a wealth effect that even if you're making the same amount of income, but the value of your home goes up by 20%, or the value of your 401k goes up by 20%, people tend to spend more when they feel wealthier. And I think this is sort of the dirty little secret of the Fed's tightening campaign, which is you can influence financial conditions by increasing the cost of credit, which encourages people to borrow less, which goes into mortgages and home buying, or you mentioned cars, the cost of credit for auto loans. But also there's a flip side of that, which is by tightening financial conditions, you reduce the value of homes and stock and bond portfolios, which hits people via the wealth effect, or hits consumption via the wealth effect. So in a way, one of the ways that the Fed can cool inflation down is by taking away wealth from the American consumer. And I'm sure this is something they wouldn't want to highlight, but that is part of the financial transmission mechanism. And so I think that, a big part of any economic slowdown that we see going forward is going to be the wealth effect. And that's obviously not going to be popular politically. So it's something policymakers would probably want to avoid discussing publicly.
Right. And that goes back to the whole thought process behind the 1-2 punch of fiscal and monetary in response to the pandemic, right? Because there was, if I'm not mistaken, there was a relatively low MPC among people who had received their stimmy checks, and there was some extrapolation or speculation, in the commentary a while ago, that this was behind part of the crypto boom, right? That they were sat at home, essentially trading risk with what Uncle Sam intended to be a lifeline. So yeah, you're making interesting points. And again, if the Fed really is going to reduce the purchasing power of the American household via a public statement that it is restoring the purchasing power of the American household, then I think we really are in a bit of a pickle. We've got another question, Nick, that I'd like to ask you. Somebody's asking about the record temperatures globally, especially in Western Europe. For example, Italy is rapidly losing crops due to the heat, and this will compound the food supply shortages out of Ukraine. So does that make sense to you, Nick, that this heat wave has come at just the wrong time?
Yeah, and on a personal note, I think whenever you have unusual weather on any given week or month, and you have a heat wave in Western Europe, or you have an unusually wet August, or whatever month of the year, people always say, well, this is climate change. And it's very difficult to pin any one event on climate change, but the number of extraordinary weather events we've had, and the upward trend in average temperatures over the last several decades clearly points to this being an increasing problem. And although it gets discussed a lot, I haven't really seen a strong global framework for climate resilience in terms of access to food supply, what this means for our economic infrastructure, for trade, and for economic activity. And a lot of ideas have been mooted around in policy circles, the idea of a Green New Deal and long-term investment in climate-friendly technologies. But for a variety of reasons, that I think would be a separate webinar of itself, we're just not there yet. But I think that this just adds to the list of challenges that we have in the global economy that we're going to feel over the next decade. And does that mean that food security is going to be an issue because of climate change in 23? I don't know. 24, maybe 25, who knows? But over the next decade, I think we're going to see more years where food security becomes a problem. And I think this just further reinforces a lot of the things we've talked about on the political and on the economic fronts. The end of the globalization trend, even if globalization itself doesn't stop, you don't have this, constant deflationary pressure, which is we can just outsource more and more and offshore more and more products.
Right.
You have that problem, and then you have the geopolitical concerns over, what Russia's doing, and then, China, which we have the geopolitical concerns over China, and then you add to this, the additional risks of climate change. And I think more broadly, that just means, we're probably looking at a decade of a lot of political volatility that will filter into the economy and the financial markets. and another source of uncertainty and another risk of additional price shocks from commodities.
I think that's right. And so sometimes I think of economists and economic policymakers as experts in not saying what they're really thinking about, right? There's so much, it's not just jargon, but there's so much hesitancy, to your point, to really talk about the difficult choices, and maybe wealth per se needs to be reduced. And so one of the equilibria that you could imagine in the future here is really Malthusian. It's population decline, it's population disruption, and it's mass immigration at a very short notice because people are moving out of areas that they simply cannot be in, right? So I think that maybe, one of the ways I'm trying to think about this now is I'm trying to look less at the political map of the world and more at the colored map of the world, the topography that you'll give a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, because I think those contours are much more informative now as to this factor population and if you like, trade and so on. So if you're saying today, Nick, that you think the next decade will be characterized by an uptick in downside political risk, I would agree with you. But would you agree with me that the existing macroeconomic framework, the existing policy mechanism, and the existing political mechanism, which we call democracy, are not best placed necessarily to handle explaining it, right? And that's not to say that autocracies are better placed at explaining it. It's just that they might not have to.
Well, I think that, you have to separate two things out here. One is, what political system do we want to live in as individuals, and what level of freedom and influence over our governments we want. And then the second is the advantages and disadvantages of policymaking. And I'll throw that first part to the side and just talk about the advantages and disadvantages of policymaking. And if you look at an autocratic government like China, they don't have to worry about midterm elections coming up. And so the time scale on which they can make decisions and planning is inevitably going to be much longer, because Chinese officials are thinking over careers and over decades rather than what happens in the next election. So I think, particularly in dealing with some of these longer term challenges like climate change, I think that non-democratic governments have some advantages in some ways, and that's certainly not a ringing endorsement of non-democratic systems of government. But I think this presents a very interesting thought experiment, or an actual real-time experiment, and how different political systems are able to adapt to climate change and other global challenges that play out over 5, 10, 15 years or more versus what plays out over the next 2 to 4 years, which is, where elected politicians are thinking.
Right. Well, look, for my money, Nick, just so that we're on the record, I'd like to live in a democracy, please. And I'm long America, because I think that if we're really talking about an uptick in real or perceived chaos in the world, the democratic system essentially corrects itself. Markets correct themselves. We don't do it perfectly, of course, because we've seen quite some volatility in the last 20 years. But I'm never sure that the surface of these countries, that are essentially autocracies, I'm never sure that the surface matches what's really going on, right? So I for my money, I think that you're right. You're absolutely right. We're going into a period of great difficulty, but we have the systems and the institutions that will cope with it, if not cope with it better.
That's an interesting point about institutional flexibility and adaptability, which I think America scores very high on, whereas a lot of these autocratic regimes, have much less flexible and adaptable institutions. And I think this is a great segue. We have one more question, which maybe we should close with, but it's related to this subject about China. Where do you see China's economy and their political calculus going over the medium term?
Medium term, well, first of all, short term, I'd watch the property market, obviously. Medium term, there's probably going to have to be some sort of litmus test for the Chinese system. The Chinese system seems to have decided that the litmus test is Taiwan, or at least rhetorically so far. And by litmus test, I mean a moment in which it transitions from presenting itself as a developing internal economy to an external-facing, consumer-based military power. And whatever that moment is, if it's Taiwan or something else, it will be fraught with peril, right? I mean, you're safe when you're on the tarmac, you're safe when you're in the air. When you're taking off, I think that you're facing the greatest number of risks. So to finish, Nick, same question to you, China.
Well, I find China to be, one of the harder countries to follow unless you're really deep into the weeds. And so I tend to rely on, a few China specialists that I talk to. But I think broadly, the biggest challenge China has is how do they go from a lower middle income country that has done a remarkable job over the last 2-3 decades of lifting people out of abject poverty into, a reasonable standard of living, and moving from that to a higher income country. And, they can't just continue to make more widgets and rely on, cheap labor and low skilled manufacturing jobs. There's a big hurdle there to get across. And I think success in the first phase of development does not necessarily guarantee or really say much at all about how much they can make it into the second part. And also, to touch on a theme that you talked about earlier about population dynamics, all of the Western industrialized economies had pretty strong population growth as they were going through industrialization. And it wasn't until we became service-based economies that you got these, collapses in population growth, or even negative population growth in a couple of countries in Europe and Japan. China has already hit the peak of its working age population, and they will probably, even with the end of one child, they will probably be headed towards zero or even negative population growth for the broader population, not just the working age. So they're going to have to confront this second hump that so many developing countries have been unable to get through, that second hump of becoming a high income, consumer-based economy with, higher value added in services. And they're going to do that. They're going to have to do that in the context of no longer having a demographic dividend. So I think that makes it all the more complicated for them. I'll leave it there. But Ed, thank you so much for a really fascinating discussion. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you both, Ed and Nick, for such a thoughtful and thorough look at the many issues that are facing central banks today.